Ladies and gentlemen, fellow colleagues, good morning and thank you for tuning in. I am Tricia Benjamin, representing the Girl Guide Association of Trinidad and Tobago, also known as GGATT. My guest today is Her Excellency Harriet Cross, who holds the title of British High Commissioner of Trinidad and Tobago. Ms. Cross considers herself a mother of cats and rabbits. Hello, Commissioner Cross, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today. It's a real pleasure.
Today, we'll be highlighting gender-based violence to our listening audience. Questions can be typed in the chat. And your response would be given before the end of this meeting. Ms. Cross, how are you today? I'm
very well, thank you very much. I actually had a decent night's sleep last night, so I'm actually feeling quite awake this morning. So you've got me on a good day.
I'm really happy to hear that. It's always good to get a good night's rest.
It is.
I would like our listeners to know a little bit about yourself. Can you please share?
I can, yeah. So I have been a British diplomat for 25 years this year, which seems like an awful long time to me. I didn't really expect to be a diplomat, so I didn't go to a private school. I didn't come from a background of people who were in the diplomatic service. My mum was a teacher, and my dad worked in a university. And so it kind of came as a surprise to me that I ended up in the diplomatic service. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do at school or at university, where I studied French and politics. But I knew I wanted to do something international. And then my friend was applying for the Foreign Service, so I thought that I would too. And here I am. And so I've done postings in Morocco, in New York, working for the UK mission to the UN. I've worked in Yemen, which is a conflict zone. I've worked in Saudi Arabia, which is a really interesting place in regards to women's rights. I was Consul General in Boston, Massachusetts, covering all of New England for the UK. And this is my first High Commissioner role. And a High Commissioner is the same as an ambassador. It's just what you call ambassadors when they sit in a Commonwealth country like Trinidad and Tobago. So as you mentioned, I don't have children, but I am an animal lover, and I've got 2 cats who came with me from the United States, rescue cats. And about 2 months ago, I was walking around Marival and I found 2 little tame rabbits on the street who I think somebody had thrown out. So now I've got 2 rabbits as well. So the family is growing. So hopefully that gives you a bit of information about me as well. I've got a husband as well, by the way. I forgot him. I put the animals first, but I do have a husband too, called Philip.
Well, nice that you add in Philip in that mix, because yes, the 4 animals, they do take a lot of priority. The World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts is the oldest and largest woman-led organization in the world. I'm interested to know, where did you first hear about guides?
I mean, I've known about guides since I was a child myself. I mean, it was always in my consciousness that there were scouts and guides. I was never a member of the guides, actually. I'm not quite sure why. But yeah, I've known them all my life. And but it's only really in my professional career that I've understood that there was a worldwide network. But I think the way that you termed it as, led by women is really important. I think sometimes people think of it as being something that children do, but actually it's a learning ground for teaching women about leadership, which I think is really shows the importance of the organization.
Well, just letting you know that it's never too late to join the organization.
Thank you.
As a woman in the professional world, have you ever been targeted because you were a woman in that space?
I don't think I would. I don't think I have a story about where I've been explicitly discriminated against, but I think like any woman, I've had what we now call microaggressions, which is a kind of new terminology. I wouldn't have used it at the time. But in my first posting in Morocco, I was maybe 23 years old. And of course, I thought I was a complete adult, older than I'd ever been. And a complete grown-up. But I found that I was quite sort of patronized by people that I met. So for example, my title was second secretary. So I was kind of middle ranking in terms of my position in the embassy. And I would go and see a minister, it'd be my job to go and see a Moroccan minister to talk about human rights or the conflict in the Western Sahara. And I'd walk into his office and he'd say, "Ah, mais vous êtes jeune, mademoiselle. You are very young, miss." And and then I would joke about it, ha ha ha, But, when I reflect upon it now, I don't think that person would have ever said to a man who walked through his door for a serious meeting, "You are very young." Because, you change the context and you say that to a man and you think, how rude, what's he trying to do there? Trying to say that I don't have the authority to have this meeting with you. It would actually be quite an aggressive thing to say to a man and wouldn't be done. What he would probably think is, oh, how impressive. This young man is impressive enough to be tasked by the Foreign Office to have this important conversation with me. He must be very important. Whereas to say, oh, you're young, oh, I'm pretty, oh, nice dress you're wearing. It's kind of a way of pushing down a woman to remember that you are a woman, and a young woman means, it's got particular meanings. It means you are not somebody with power. You are not somebody who is going to be able to influence me in this conversation. So that's something that has stuck with me a little bit, when you talk about women's appearances, oh, does that woman look old? Does she look young? What's she wearing? It's a way of detracting from their intellectual abilities. And I think even if it's not consciously done, and I think sometimes it's not consciously done, but we talk about the patriarchy as being this system that we all live in that is designed for men, that sometimes people react on in the way that the patriarchy has conditioned them to react, and it's detrimental to women. So, and those things happen quite a lot in my career. But they're such small things. Sometimes you think, oh, am I highlighting it too much? And clearly there are much more awful, devastating things that happen to women because of the patriarchy and because of gender-based violence. And I know we'll go on to talk about them. But when the small things are happening too, it means that the problem stretches from one end of the spectrum to the other. And you need to take action at both ends of the spectrum, I would suggest.
Definitely joining in that fight to take action on both spectrums of it. And I'm glad that you are out of that experience wiser, stronger, and better for it. Another question: what is the role of the British High Commission to Trinidad and Tobago with respect to ending gender-based violence?
Okay, that is a brilliant question. So ending gender-based violence is one of a number of activities that we do, which we would put under the umbrella of our human rights activity or our inclusion activity. So other things that we do might be, climate change or LGBT plus rights, or campaigning against the death penalty, and campaigning against gender-based violence fits within that umbrella. And actually you find that, again, maybe it's something that we'll talk about, women are often up against multiple discriminations. So if it's about the colour of their skin or their sexuality or their social status, sometimes they've got multiple discriminations. And so, for example, when we're talking about climate change, women are often more affected by climate change than men. So actually, the gender aspect falls into a lot of different things that we do. But when you're talking specifically about gender-based violence, the UK government wants to support governments, universities, non-governmental organisations like yourself who are working to tackle this issue. So we would never do anything almost on our own. We would always want a Trinidad and Tobago partner to work with. So sometimes it's about using small pots of money to help an organisation carry out training. So in the past, for example, we funded the Lily Foundation in Tobago, who actually work in a number of different ways. They work with men and boys to talk about gender-based violence and to try and change the culture and the understanding amongst young men in particular in Tobago. And they also do some work on sort of psychological counselling for women and men who have been involved in gender-based violence. So there's an example of some of the work we do. I think getting the message out there that people shouldn't suffer in silence, that this is an issue that regardless of whatever culture you are in, it is wrong. I'm a firm believer that there are some things that are wrong, and if you are causing pain, whether that's psychological or physical, to another human being or frankly animal, I think those things are wrong. And people within the community need to be empowered to make change themselves within their own communities. There's no point in the British High Commission coming in, you know, with our Union Jack flags and saying we're going to make this change. The change has to be done by the people on the ground themselves. And then again, at the other end of the spectrum, change also needs to happen in terms of legislation. Because if you've got people and organisations like yourself, like the Lily Foundation, working with people on the ground, the change that they're trying to make needs to be supported by legislation. So, for example, we've had consultations with the Office of the Attorney General about legislation in relation to women's rights and protection of women. And we've also done work with the police force. So one example that we've done, we did some work with the team of police that work with women who are subject to sexual abuse. And so we gave them some training from the UK. So this is how police in the UK deal with victims and survivors. And this is how they are best prosecuted. This is how you can find evidence. So for example, we work with a UN body called UN LIREC. And they're a UN body that works on guns and light weapons. So they've got a project where they look at violence that has happened to women with use of a weapon, and they train the police. This is how you can find out the forensics of the particular bullet that was used if there was a murder, or this is how you debrief a survivor to get information from them about what sort of guns were used in your assault. So there are lots of different ways in which we can all play a role in tackling gender-based violence. It falls into many different parts of a country's makeup, and we try and work in as many of those dimensions as we can.
Actually, you really inspired me to look at my views a little more critically with your answer. And I admired how you spoke of including the local arms on that decision-making aspect of it, because we do find sometimes culturally things are different from one country to the other. So marrying the two really makes a lot of sense. I would really like to know though, what does gender-based violence mean to you?
So again, I think there's the obvious side of gender-based violence. So when I think about what does that mean, it means women, in short, it means women getting hurt. And that might be physically, and it often is physically, but there are also ways in which women are abused, particularly within a relationship, that can be psychological. You hear particularly, sometimes we call it domestic violence, which I think sometimes minimizes it. And so to call it gender-based violence, again, it adds some weight to the term. I think, for example, in the UK, it's almost like, especially in the past, domestic violence was just a fact of life. It's just what happened in a relationship. And so that sort of thinking has to change. And that's maybe the most obvious side of when we think about gender-based violence. So women in relationships, women who are attacked by men as they're going home from work, for example, women in their everyday lives who cannot continue their everyday life because they are under attack, either from men they know or from men they don't know. But actually, quite often, the majority of times, it's from men that women know. And I think sometimes that when I think about gender-based violence, I think about education as being a really important facet in protecting women and men. We're not just talking about educating women against violence, because the majority of it happens in very boring suburban settings. You know, there are horrific crimes that happen, but, you know, women listening to this call, I don't want them to be afraid and think, oh gosh, you know, am I going to get murdered? That's really not really what we're talking about here. That's a very small piece of the violence. It's actually the boring stuff that's sometimes the most horrific stuff, that, you know, women are making dinner, the man that they are living with decides it's not good enough, and they're angry about so many different things, and then take it out on the woman in their life. So teaching men and women how to manage anger and how to deal with people who are angry is part of the solution, I think. But then maybe onto the more policy, or the more sort of government side of gender-based violence that maybe people think about less. So I mentioned climate change before. Women can be subject to violence, and that might be violence of climate change, you know? So because they are most likely to be poorer than men, they have less money, less economic status than men, and if they are looking after children and men are no longer in the family, and women are trying to deal with food shortages or hurricanes or tropical storms, and they are bodily hurt because of that storm, because they haven't been able to pay for the protection of a decent house, that for me is an example of gender-based violence, because violence has been done against women because of their economic and social status. So we need to think about those sorts of issues as well, making sure women are in education and that they are able to go to school. I hear some really good organisations in Trinidad and Tobago talking about period poverty. There's an example of if a young woman or a child is not able to deal with the fact that she's having periods because she can't find or pay for the sort of equipment that she needs to deal with that, she won't go to school, and she won't learn, and she won't be able to get a decent job, and she won't be able to be part of the economy. Having money protects you from things, right? I think that's a really it sounds like a really obvious or maybe quite a stark thing to say. And I'm not talking about being a millionaire, but I'm talking about being able to bring home a wage that allows you to live comfortably enough to have heating, to have food, to have a fridge that works, to have lighting. And you need to educate women in order to get them into the workforce that allows them to be independently able to bring home money that allows them to do that. So for me, when you talk about gender-based violence, it's so much bigger than the first thing that I talked about. Sexual and reproductive health rights. This is a big issue at the moment with what's going on in the States. I think women should be able to choose how they manage their reproductive health. And so that for me is also a part of this puzzle, because if you can't control that, you're in a more vulnerable position and more likely to be abused, I would say. So I'll stop there. I think I gave you a very long answer, but there's a lot of dimensions to this problem. So I wanted to get as many of them across as possible.
And your dimensions were all noted. You actually piqued my interest when you mentioned in one of the terms of gender-based violence, or one of the types of gender-based violence. So I just wanted to share with our listening audience that there is physical violence, verbal violence, psychological violence, sexual violence, socioeconomic violence, which is one thing that you mentioned quite a lot in this statement, domestic violence or intimate relationship violence, and harassment and sexual harassment. So those are the different types of gender-based violence. Hi, Commissioner. According to our Pan American Health Organization website of Trinidad and Tobago, 1 in every 3 women have experienced gender-based violence in her lifetime. Why do you think it's important that we advocate for female rights and prevention to such violence?
Well, firstly, I'll just go back to that point about if people are hurting, we need to protect them. But secondly, the bigger picture is if you want Trinidad and Tobago to be a strong, prosperous, proud country, 50% of its population need to be strong and empowered and be part of that leadership, whether it's economic or political. And if women are subject to violence, they cannot play an effective role in the economy or the political leadership of a country. And when I talk about political leadership, I don't just mean being ministers. I mean being leaders in their community, doing the sort of things that I know yourself and a number of women on this call represent those leadership positions. So that's the sort of leadership I'm talking about. Everybody can be a leader and everybody can play a role in making their country stronger and more prosperous. And you have to tackle gender-based violence for that to happen. It's just not possible to make those advances without it. So for everybody to be stronger and safer and more prosperous, women have to be too. So that would be the initial answer I would give. And also that all that potential in women that is not being tapped into, because if a woman stops going to school because she is being bullied because of her sexuality or because of the sort of home that she comes from, that person could be, if she'd have been given the opportunity to advance and to be supported, she could be the next entrepreneur who's doing some amazing app that will change the world. Trinidad and Tobagonians are a really educated population. That is very true. But imagine how much more could be done, how much more amazing you could be if this domestic violence was dramatically reduced. You would free up all that human ability. And I think that's what should drive the government and individuals to make this a priority. It's not just about women. I think that's sometimes what it, do we, these big, proud, important people, need to worry about the woman who's subject to domestic violence in Faizabad? Yes, you do, because it's all part of the picture that builds into the sort of country that you can be and want to be.
On the heels of explaining in education and gender-based violence, I wanted to know what you think about advocacy and empowerment. How does that aid to permanently fight the removal of violence against women?
So you've touched on an issue that is particularly important to me. So I haven't even mentioned it up until now, but for me, this word negotiation, I think if you can teach women how to negotiate and advocate for themselves, it's giving them a very powerful tool. And sometimes it's about just, negotiating within the family, because families negotiate with each other all the time. And ultimately, I say negotiation is about getting somebody to give you what you want, but in a very cunning way, So if you negotiate well, you can make things happen for yourself without the other person necessarily knowing that that's what you're doing. And so that is so important for giving women power in their relationships with other people. But it's also power in the economy, because again, if you are a woman working in any sort of job, doesn't have to be some sort of amazing job where you're negotiating millions of dollars worth of exchange. It can be you as an employee negotiating, look, I need this time off for these reasons and you should give it to me for these reasons. That's a negotiation. So I would love to see women taught more effectively about how they can negotiate and then therefore advocate for themselves and for other people. If you read the research, women are actually really good at negotiating on behalf of other people. And again, I think that's partly the way women have been socialized and brought up. They're good at, defending other people and looking after their own. And, if you, ever see a mother in particular defending her children, she will do it brilliantly. But you ask a woman to negotiate on behalf of herself, women don't do it as effectively as men. And there are kind of scientific sort of experiments that have shown this. And so I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. And again, it goes back to this part about making sure that women have leadership roles. When you look at conflict situations, and again, that's something we haven't really talked about, partly because I was trying to talk quite a lot about the Trinidad and Tobago situation, and it's not the same. But if you're thinking about women in Afghanistan and Iraq and Russia, Ukraine, women are more likely to be victims of the conflict that happens, rape during war. But if you move on and say, well, what happens at the end of a conflict? In the past, before sort of gender-based issues were really on the scene, and it was always men who negotiated the peace agreements and what would happen next. Whereas actually then it was the women who were at the forefront of, again, trying to pull families back together, trying to earn money for their families. So the UN has said the more, and again, this has been proven, the more women mediators and negotiators you have when a conflict is trying to be resolved, the better solution that you'll have at the end of the day. So again, bringing it back to a context like Trinidad and Tobago, where it's not a conflict, but if you organizations like yourself can teach women to stand up for themselves and negotiate and advocate, not just for themselves and their families, but for other women and for ending gender-based violence, you will create a whole cadre, a whole generation of women who are ready to take on the world in a way that maybe previous generations either haven't been able to or tried to do. I mean, when you look at the women of the 70s and 80s, I was born in 74, so I guess I was really a child during the 70s and 80s and wasn't really involved in that sort of radical feminism that we saw in the 70s and 80s that actually had a dramatic transformational effect on the world. And I think there are elements in which that is being rolled back now, and we need to use advocacy and women's rights to empower women to do some more of that radical transformation, because we need those women again. And I would be really interested to hear if there are any women on the call who were campaigning in the 70s and 80s, and I'd be interested in their reflections on what today looks like to them.
I am very sure we'll get their feedback very soon, because I know I know that there are some. But a point that you made earlier, and I just wanted to touch on it, talking about recognizing women fighting, it's easier to advocate for others, but not for ourselves. And I remember in the guides doing, it was a weekend trip, and one of the activities was they had to meet a new guider, and say something either that you admired or you liked about them, list it. And it was amazing to see all the things, you just met somebody and you are listing all these things about her. Looking at the responses from the other person, they didn't really see themselves like that, but it was actually easy to list it. The other part of that was they had to list things that they admired or liked about themselves. And that took such a while to be able to do, because you just don't see it for yourself. You don't, you are thankful that somebody else sees it in you, but you seeing it for yourself, sometimes it is a bit challenging. So I remember that in what you shared earlier. I would like to know, what does the world look like to you? What would it look like to you if gender-based violence was eradicated?
I mean, to a certain extent, I'm not even sure what the answer to that is, because we have always lived in a world with such gender inequality that I can't even imagine what the world would be like if that wasn't there. It's such a weight on the world. And I mean, I think the world would be a much better place. I think there'd be less violence. I think there would be more solutions than problems. And I think we would see more creativity in the world, because quite often when we talk inside my organisation about inclusion, we talk about making sure that you have different perspectives to enable you to be a stronger organisation. So that's why there's no point in me appointing another 5 white middle-aged women from the north of England. I might get on with them really well, and we might understand each other really well, but we'll all kind of have the same perspective when it comes to solving problems. But if I get a young black gay guy on my team, he'll bring a whole different set of perspectives and open my eyes to things that I hadn't thought about. If I bring an older woman in a wheelchair who has had to navigate the world from a very different perspective to me, again, not only will she have a whole set of different life experiences that will have given her skills that I don't have, she'll spot solutions and problems and risks that I won't have seen. So if you had a world without gender-based violence, I think the lens through which we as the human race views the world would be very different, because the things that our leaders at all levels, the way we live our lives would be very different. I mean, I think it's a bit of a cliche, but I think when you look at countries, particularly in the north of Europe, so it's Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, those are places in the world that have spent a lot of money and have had the money to spend, but have spent it on creating gender equality. So it's much easier for women to find, men and women, to get childcare. Men have a lot of paternity leave as much as women have maternity leave. And that has created a certain amount of equality in the populations. And I think that their countries are economically stronger as a result, and there is less conflict. So that's what I would think would occur, but I don't know how long that will take us to get to that stage. And I just want to reflect on, I was really touched by what you said, really moved when you were talking about getting people to list things that they admire in others, and then getting yourself to list things. Because sometimes when women talk to me, whatever age they are, women just talk like this all the time. Oh, you know what? I just need to get back to exercising. I just need to lose a bit of weight. I haven't exercised for like 6 weeks and I can feel myself getting fatter. And you just think, this is terrible. This is an example of the patriarchy, like, living in your brain. And although I fall for it as well, I'm just as likely to be the person saying that. But, I say, you think like that and the patriarchy wins. You say, oh my God, I'm looking older. I need to try and look younger. That's it. The patriarchy has won, and you can say goodbye to having a world where there's more gender equality. You have to fight it yourself. You have to fight that voice in your head that's saying you're not good enough, and that you can't list all your good qualities because you know of all the bad qualities that you have, and this, that, and the other. You have to be your own best advocate, your own best friend, and you personally, every single day, sometimes every time you look in the mirror, you've got to fight the patriarchy, and it's a difficult task. But everybody has to work hard on it, and it's partly about that personal thing. It's also about getting out there and doing something and making a difference in the world, and helping women who are less fortunate than you. So whether that's helping somebody get out of a situation that they're in, or funding an organisation that will empower women leaders, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but it's a massive task. And so the more of us that can work on it, the quicker that situation will be when we've got a more equal world.
Thanks for sharing that idea with us. I agree with your statement. If there was not gender-based violence, a lot of energies would be in different places. We would see things differently. We would view and handle them differently. So I definitely do agree with that. And I just wanted to add, since you were talking about weight, in my weight journey, I actually lost weight when I stopped fighting myself to do this or do that, or having to do this and having to do that. When acceptance came, that was it. I lost that weight.
Yeah.
Do you know anyone who has been affected by gender-based violence?
I'll say yes, not really in my immediate circle of friends or family, but partly within my work. One of the things that we do as the British High Commission, we provide services for British citizens who live in Trinidad and Tobago, and if they are vulnerable or in trouble, then we help them. And so I have been communicating with somebody who is a victim or a survivor, somebody who is going through domestic violence at the moment, and there's a British angle to that, and so that's really made me think carefully about my responses to it and the choices that people make, which are not always as self-evident if you're in the middle. It's quite easy, I think, from a distance to say, well, I would have done this and I would have done that and I wouldn't have reacted that way. But you realise that actually, if you're in the middle of a violent situation, sometimes you do things that you think will protect you, even though maybe from the outside you can see that they won't. And people in Trinidad have talked to me a few times, a few different people have talked to me about the upbringings that they had where their father was quite violent towards their mother, and they experienced that as a child in the household. And again, I can't imagine what sort of perspective that gives you on life as well. And this one person who was telling me this story said, oh, I've forgiven my father now, which again, I thought was a very strong thing to do. And, I'm sure that we haven't talked much about the role of men and boys in bringing an end to gender-based violence, but they do have a really important role to play, and very much need to be part of the conversation for all sorts of different reasons. And I think that's why we've talked a bit about the economy, but social status and ability to work and bring in a wage has an impact on gender-based violence and the actions of men and the reactions and actions of women. So that's also something that I've thought about when I've been speaking to people directly about their experiences.
I am actually admiring the fact that you had the opportunity and you took the opportunity to socialize and speak with women or people, you didn't state if it was only women, who suffered from gender violence. And then your perspective changed when you had that interaction, because those things did not necessarily happen to you, but when you entered their conversation, you realize that, no, it's not so easy, to have that introspection and make different decisions. What role do you think the Girl Guides Association of Trinidad and Tobago can play in parenting with stakeholders in the fight against gender-based violence?
I think it's a role of education, primarily, I would suggest, that you are working with people within your communities to, firstly, just having a conversation about gender-based violence is a really important role, because it is all too often something that's too difficult or too awkward to talk about. So that is a role that you're playing first off, but then educating people about the challenges of gender-based violence and the different dimensions of gender-based violence. Also providing role models for women, which is again really important. When girls see women who are leaders in their community or who have survived gender-based violence and come out the other side and have got advice to give, I think that is also a very important role. And awareness raising above and beyond the girls that you are directly involved in, but you will be influencing their parents and their aunties and uncles as well, because people will be having conversations about what happened in Girl Guides. So I think that community role is important. And also I'd say when you have the ability to try and influence government, again, on the legislative side, if you've got demands or requests, like we really think we need this legislation, then adding your voice to all the other voices, again, is really important too. I think sometimes people think, well, me as an individual, and what does my vote matter? Or me as a small organisation, what can we do? But when you bring enough people together, it is powerful. So you are part of the campaigning voice. And the more people that you bring on board, the stronger that voice will be. So I think you've got a very important role to play.
Thank you for that answer. And we would continue doing what we have been doing. In your view, what does the role of men and boys play in ending gender-based violence?
They are 50% of the solution, I would suggest. Women cannot solve this problem on their own, and men cannot solve the problem on their own. It needs to be joint action. And I think men always need to be part of the conversation. Sometimes men need to listen. Sometimes it might be any sort of meeting. And sometimes I think, wow, I've listened to a lot of men in this meeting or in this social gathering. You know, men really sometimes really like to talk. And sometimes I find that men are quicker to talk about things they don't know much about than women are. And that's not necessarily a criticism of men. It might be criticism of women. So sometimes I think, although they must be part of the solution and they must be part of the conversation, we need to be careful that men don't dominate a conversation that they are brought in to participate in. Because again, the way that the patriarchy works, the way we've always been socialized is, if there's a tall man with a strong voice and imposing presence, we want to listen to him because that's the way we have been brought up. And sometimes if you've got a woman who's quieter or she's looking quite pretty or whatever, then we're maybe less likely to listen to her. So I do, much as we need to involve men in the conversation and the solution, I talked earlier about the economic situation of men, and the education of men is an important part of that. Sometimes it's just time to say, this is not your time to speak. This is not your time to lead. This is our time. There's a few men in my life who I'm really, proud of, who really want to say, you know what, we've had. I think one man said to me, because I was concerned because we try and make sure the interview panels, there are women as well as men on the interview panels. And there was this one situation where I was going to end up with all women on the interview panels, and I was saying, oh, I'm a bit worried about it. We would never allow an all male panel, so can we allow an all female panel? And he said, Harriet, we have had, all male everything for the last 2,000 years. I think you're all right having a one interview panel, And so that kind of stepping back, men who are big enough and man enough to step back and say, you take the stage, I will listen to you, are to be cherished and nurtured. And we need more men like that. But men also have some brilliant ideas, and men speaking to men is part of the solution. There's a really good advert in the UK at the moment, which it's probably on YouTube, you can Google it, which is about seeing this group of men out on a night out, having finished in the pub, had a few drinks, and a woman walks past on her own to the bus stop. And one was like, oh, give us a smile. Why aren't you smiling at me? You could at least give me a smile. You're such a pretty girl. And she's clearly sort of terrified. And all the other men are kind of like hanging back a little bit, because this leader of the pack is, having his time with this woman. And you kind of see the thought bubbles from one of his friends saying, ugh, that's a really icky thing to do. And I'm really kind of embarrassed and I just want to put my head down. And then he's like, well, this is where you intervene. And it is possible to intervene in such a way that doesn't create conflict, but that dampens it down. So he's like, come on, man, I think she's had enough of you and your sweet talk. Let's get on our way, And so they're encouraging men to be part of the solution. You know, you don't have to make a big song and dance about it, but do not be an observer in another man's abuse of a woman, regardless of how small or large that is. And so I think that is a really important role that men can play, because sometimes if another woman is observing gender-based violence, she may feel that she doesn't have the physical presence or the right gender to be taken seriously by that person, whereas a man is more likely to be able to intervene successfully in a situation like that. So I would also say to any men who are listening, you know, think about ways in which that you can be an advocate and an ally for women, not just those in your life, but women who you encounter in your everyday life who may be struggling with a problem of gender-based violence in some shape or form.
This is an interesting question, because I want to know when do you think is the optimal age to have conversations with young people about gender violence?
I would say as soon as they can talk and understand vocabulary, I really do. I saw a brilliant little TikTok video last week of a mother in a car with her, I think, 3-year-old child, and she was saying, we've got a delay, I'm just in the car, so I'm just trying to think of something to do with my child. And actually I thought I'd teach them about their bodily integrity. So she was saying to her little 3-year-old girl, so this is your body, right? And you decide what you want anybody to do to your body, and they do not get to decide. Is that right? Whose body is this? It's my body. Okay. What do you say if you don't want somebody to touch you in any way, whether it's your grandma giving you a hug, you don't want your grandma to give you a hug, or you don't want a strange man in the street? So what do you say? It's my body and I decide, you know? And she was saying that to a 3-year-old. And I think getting that knowledge that you are powerful, and that you don't have to submit to other people is an important message at that age. Now, clearly, I need to emphasize at this point that you know, quite often women do say no and they are still abused, clearly. But that was just an example of some very, you know, gentle conversations that you can have with children. And I think it's really important, and that's to boys as well, you know, the importance of respecting women and reaffirming equality between boys and girls is really, really important. And being careful not to show bias when you're dealing with a girl child as you are with a boy child. You know, sometimes it will be, you know, a boy child can take rough and tumble, but we mustn't let the little girl fall over and hurt her knee because she's very precious. And that sort of thing, again, builds up this sense of vulnerability of young children. So I think right from the earliest times, and when children, especially when children are going into puberty, teaching them about sexual reproductive health rights and the importance of consent in any relationship is absolutely critical. And I'd like to see more of that in Trinidad and Tobago. I know there are some campaigning groups that really work for that, and I really applaud them. Because again, it's part of the education piece, and education is power. I'll stop there on that answer.
Education is power, and with 3 children of my own, 2 teenagers and 1 8-year-old, I don't take your share lightly, because I agree with everything that you just said. Can you provide organizations in the UK that the Girl Guides Association can partner with on this fight against gender violence?
That's something that I'd have to come back to you on. It sort of depends what sort of partnerships you're interested in, what sort of, whether it's a campaigning or whether it's sharing of material or sharing of best practice. So I'm very happy for us to have a conversation about what that might look like after this call.
Sure, I'll be sure to send all the emails of questions and waiting for the response. Now, a group of girls appeared at a Boy Scout rally declaring that they should be Girl Guides or Girl Scouts at that time. In that same year of 1909, guiding was born. Would you regard girl guiding be generated, as being generated, the first woman-led organization through advocacy?
That's a difficult question. It's a very leading question. And I don't have my history books in front of me, but it sounds like it's a really good example of protest. And this is leading me down a slightly different track now, but we saw protests in Trinidad and Tobago yesterday. In the UK, there were protests yesterday about the price of petrol and fuel. This is Pride Month, where we celebrate the LGBT plus community, but Pride started out as a protest against discrimination. So I think sometimes standing up for your rights and being a difficult person and causing problems is sometimes what is needed to get a message across, and that is clearly what that first courageous woman did to found the Girl Guides. So sounds like she is a bit of a role model for all of us. Do you know what her name was?
Actually, no, but it wasn't a woman. She was just a child. It was her and her group of friends. They were seeing I guess their brothers and their cousins go out whatever day of the week that was, and learning all these things and having all this learning fun while learning, and they wanted to be part of that, and they said, no, the boys can't have this alone. Let us have something for the girls also. And that was the birth of guiding. So this is my last question. In terms of advocacy, how does advocating make you feel? You've shared a lot of the different organizations of advocacy. How does that make you feel?
I think it gives me a number of different emotions. To a certain extent, advocacy can give you back some power. I think sometimes in the face of the extent of gender-based violence, you can feel a bit powerless to stop it. And so being part of an advocacy movement can give you back some power. It makes me feel proud that the United Kingdom government prioritizes the fight against gender-based violence so much. I mean, we spend a lot of money around the world, but particularly in the most vulnerable countries, particularly in Africa, where income is very much lower than it is in Trinidad and Tobago. And we are investing in women's education and entrepreneurship. And when we are in the UN talking about mediation in conflicts in Democratic Republic of Congo or in Afghanistan, we are advocating for women negotiators. So that makes me really proud to be part of that community. But I think it can also be frustrating to be somebody who advocates, because especially on an issue like this, progress is slow and rights can be rolled back. And sometimes that can be dispiriting. So I've got so much respect for men and women who really dedicate their lives to advocacy. And look at, we wouldn't have seen the progress in the world that we have seen up until now without these people. Actually, women's rights have moved on an awful lot in the last 50 years, in the last 20 years. And that's because people have protested, they have worked within their communities, they have talked to their friends, they have funded work to make change happen. So it's actually a really wonderful feeling to be part of a movement that is making a difference. So I hope that everybody on this call also feels that they are part of that community of change. And I'll be really interested to learn more about what you are doing in the future on gender-based violence. I mean, we haven't talked much about that. If you wanted just to give me a couple of highlights as to the work that you're doing to tackle it, I'd be really, really interested to hear that.
I would love to, but because of time, we would have to share that on a different day. At this time, I invite the members of the audience to please state your name and the area you're from when typing in your questions, because we will be taking your questions at this time.
while people are thinking of questions, I just want to read you this tiny little poem that came to me today. And it's about, as much as anything else, it's about advocacy, but it was written by a poet in Nazi Germany just after the Holocaust. And it's basically an argument against apathy. It's an argument for the connectedness of all people. So whether you think, actually gender-based violence has nothing to do with me, you know, either I'm a man, so it doesn't affect me, or I'm a woman and I've never had anything, gender-based violence never bothered me. It's just a really short poem and I really love it, so I'll just read it now. It's called First They Came, and I'm sure a lot of you will have heard it before. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I think that, when we're talking about advocacy, is such a powerful, tiny little poem. And it should encourage us all to be part of a movement for making change, whether it affects us directly or not.
That was very, very powerful in some short words. So we have Ms. Joy Dillon from Port of Spain, and she asks, do leaders need to have experience?
Hi, Joy. Very nice to hear from you. I would say no, would be my initial answer. I won't go into some people are born leaders, some people have leadership thrust upon them or whatever it is. I think it's greatness rather than leadership. But I don't think you do need, I think somebody who is passionate about an issue can be a leader regardless of their education, formal or otherwise. So no, I really try and dispel the concept that you have to have a university education to be a leader, or you have to have been trained to be a leader. No, if people want to follow you because you've got something important to say and you can make a difference, then you are a leader. Having said that, I think there are ways to train young people in particular, young women in particular, to be leaders. And partly it's about being ready to make mistakes. I think that is, again, something that women are less able to do than men because they are less forgiving of themselves and people are less forgiving of them. But if you've always got to get something right, you don't ever try anything. You don't ever stand up in a room full of people and tell them your opinion because you think, well, my opinion might be wrong, or the plan of action that I'm suggesting might be wrong. So I think teaching people to deal with being wrong and having failures and not being perfectionists is kind of a first step. Then finding their voices, that whole thing about, and you'll have to tell me the name of the civil rights activists in the US who said this, if you don't have a seat at the table, bring your own chair, you know, which is another brilliant line. And I'll find her name later on if nobody can pop up with it in the chat. And that's exactly part of being a leader as well. Don't wait for somebody to invite you to be a leader. Don't wait for them to train you to be a leader. If there's a bunch of leaders sitting around a table and there's not a chair for you, ask a couple of them, you know, either metaphorically or physically, to move aside and make room for you to come in because you've got something to say. So helping people find their voice is part of that. And then just supporting them, encouraging them, telling them that they are good enough is fine. You don't have to be this wonderful leader that's all singing, all dancing. If you can make a change, and if you can bring people with you, that's good enough. Shirley Chisholm, thank you very much, Khalifa. So that's what I would say about leadership.
Thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, High Commissioner Cross, for sharing your views and experiences with us today. Would you like to say a few words in closing?
I would just like to say again, thank you. As you can tell, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I love being in groups of experienced, interesting women, and I can tell that I am among such a group now. I think you're doing brilliant work to support the young women who come after you, and that's very, very important. To the people who are listening to this, I hope you've got a sense that the British High Commission is interested in engaging in Trinidad and Tobago with community leaders as much as we are with ministers and legislators. So don't be a stranger. I'm on Twitter at HarryVX. We're on Twitter UK and Caribbean. So you can always find us on there and share ideas if there are things that you think we should be involved in. We don't have huge amounts of money. Don't necessarily come to us thinking that we can fund loads of exciting projects, but we are creative and we're always happy to facilitate conversations. And this was one really good example of a partnership with the Girl Guides Association and with the British High Commission. So I thank you for initiating it. And I hope we will stay in touch. We'll follow up on that point about organisations in the UK with whom you might want to build a relationship. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our listening and viewing audience for sharing your time and questions with the Girl Guides Association of Trinidad and Tobago on this important issue of gender-based violence. Additionally, I wish to thank my guiding colleagues for attending today, our membership for its continued support, to Ms. Dillon, Ms. Joy Dillon, Ms. Klein, and Mr. Blackburn, and all the persons involved in making this interview possible. Thank you. And we can continue to get updates on all our Girl Guide activities and events by following us on social media. We are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. You can email us at girlguidestnt@gmail.com or contact our headquarters at 628-7966. On behalf of the Girl Guides Association of Trinidad and Tobago, I am Tricia Benjamin, thanking you and signing off. Have a great day.